stuff. I read a section that I thought really applied to Revelation. And I know many of you have been struggling with different things and the flow of events and it keeps going back and forth and stuff like that. So I ran into this. This is about music, but I think it applies to Revelation as well. This is Ted Giorio's Delta Blues. And he said, if Western music is like a skyscraper, sharply delineated in meticulous and intricate scores, following rules of almost Euclidean precision, then African music, and by association the blues, is more akin to those rivers whose geography is so often intertwined with the history of the music, not pursuing a rigidly straight course or obeying perfect regularities in their progress, but no less powerful for these emissions. And he talks to a guy, he talks about a guy who goes to Africa to study African music, and he's studying Dagomba drumming, which is a communal drumming they do in Africa. And he was writing a essay on it. And he says, I found that if I tried to demonstrate how to enter with one drum by counting from another's drum beat, I could not do it. The only way to begin correctly was to listen a minute and then start right in. Good advice here. That's true of Revelation as well. We think, when we think of the Bible, we think of Paul and his rigid arguments about Christianity. We think about the Gospels that are telling a story about the life of Jesus. And then we get to letters. And the letters, they're just personal letters, but again, you can get something systematic out of them. And then there's Revelation. And if you've noticed, it's like following a river. And I don't know if you've ever gone down river. We used to go snow machining down rivers when I was in Fairbanks, and they do not run straight. Matter of fact, sometimes you find you're going backwards, and then you bend around this way, and then you're bending around that way. Well, Revelation does that. And the only way to really get a hold of it is to let it get a hold of you. And so we struggle with wanting to put systematic questions in there. And sometimes they just don't work because it's not a systematic book. It's a story that's told like a flowing river. And not even like the Gospels where Jesus is born, he does this, he does this, he does this. The Gospel of Mark, the biggest word in there is immediately. Immediately he does this, immediately he does this, immediately he does, and down through. Or Matthew, who's got a schema for his book where you have 5 major speeches that correspond to the 5 books of the Torah. Or for Luke, who is trying to show, it's debatable whether he's trying to show the Christians that the Romans aren't that bad, or he's trying to show the Romans that the Christians aren't that bad. But he's got an agenda there. And then John is doing a very theological view of who Jesus is. But Revelation doesn't do any of that. It flows and it has a pattern, but the pattern repeats. 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. And one week we get to Jesus is reigning over all and every knee shall bow and all that. And then you would think that would be the end, but comparing it to the Messiah, no, you've got this great buildup, and then you're going to get back in it again and go with it and go with it. So it's almost a book you have to feel as much as it's one to understand. And John is not necessarily trying to impart a theology. He's telling a story, and we're defined by the stories we tell. And that for them, the story was, we're little bitty creatures in a little enclave in very large cities in an area where the story is the story of Rome. You buy a lamp, it's got Caesar's inscription on it. You have coins, they have Caesar's inscription on them. You go to the marketplace and there's an altar to Caesar there. I mean, you can't get away from that. That's the dominant story. And John is trying to give them an alternative story. And that's always hard. You know, part of the reason we're having the social issues I think we're having now is we're changing stories, or people are interrupting the story that we've always thought of America. You know, Columbus sailed over, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, found America. Actually never set foot on this continent, but on islands out there. And then the French sent people, and the Spanish sent people, and the English sent a lot of people over here. And then they colonized the New World, and they brought forth this amazing form of government. And it's been, you know, we were the progressive, we were the almost chosen people, the city on a hill. People talked about themselves in that way. And then as we became more and more prosperous, because we had oodles of land, and they could just send more and more people over. And we had the westward expansion where we went out and we cultivated the land and got all the way to the west, and look at what a great nation we are. And then, you know, we're kind of sitting there doing our own thing, and World War I comes along, and Wilson puts a toe in the water of internationalism and says, you know, well, we're going to join. The war's almost over, but we decided we're going to join in 1917. And then World War II comes, and we end that war being the greatest nation on earth. And we're the shining light. We're the paragon of what democracy is. And that's the story we kind of learn in school. Well, recently there's been a few people saying, wait a second, there were people already here when you came. And most of them died either by disease or you stole us. And we go, well, that's not the story we tell. And then another group is saying, you know, you didn't come over here alone. You had to go to Africa and get a bunch of us and bring us over. And they want that story to be told. We're going, no, that's not the story. That's not the story. You know, we don't necessarily want to have these elements come in there because it interrupts our story. But there are insistent groups saying, wait a second. I mean, I heard a Latino comic say the other night, we didn't cross the border because they were living in California. The border crossed us. California used to be part of Mexico, Atzalan. And then, you know, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And boom, we're in America now. How did that happen? And that creates social turbulence when that happens, and you try to change the story. So while in some cases it may be about race, and and there's instances of that, but a lot of this is about other people wanting their stories heard too. And so there's a lot of people going, that's not the story. You know, there's a 1629 project, 1617 project, where they go into schools and they teach the history of slavery. And there are states that have banned that. You cannot teach that in our schools because they don't want that to be a part of the story. You know, we presbyteries started doing land acknowledgments before their meeting, saying that we are on the land of the Umpqua Cow Creek herd tribe of Indians, and to admit that this land really did belong to someone else before we got here, and that's causing all sorts of dissension. John is trying to tell you a story of this is what it looks like when you're not a part of the Roman story, and he wants to give them something to hang their hat on. You know, you know what the Roman story looks like. We came, we brought the roads, we brought peace, we brought, you know, trade, we brought all this stuff, and we should thank us. And there are people going, wait a second, what's this about us having to bow down to your gods? You know, and whether you're Jewish or Christian, you only believe in one God. The story's not quite as glorious as it is to others who tell the story. So that's part of John's agenda. He's trying to give the people a different story. But it's a cosmic story. And what's interesting is there are tons of apocalyptic literature before Revelation comes in. There's a ton of apocalyptic literature that was written about the time of Revelation, but only Revelation was chosen for reasons that may not be obvious to anybody. The church chose John's story to be the apocalypse, and that's the story that John tells. And so, you know, we struggle with it because we want to find a way to get it systemized in our head, because we're just used to doing things that way. John's trying to give them a new story to live into. The new story is that, yeah, there's a bunch of bad stuff going in the world, but God is still in control. Yes, they're coming to get you sometimes. Yes, there are martyrs. But Jesus conquered through his own death and resurrection, as will you. There, you know, the sea of martyrs down there, John saying, it looks like they died in a vain cause, because what did their deaths mean? And John saying, they're in heaven under the heavenly altar. And they're the most esteemed in heaven right now. And so he's trying to flip over their version of the story with a new story. A story where it's not Rome, it's not the Caesar, it's the story of Jesus, the crucified Lamb. And that story sums it up to pretty much, you know, there's not there are bits of the Gospel of Matthew and bits of the Gospel of Mark that have apocalyptic elements in them. But John's story is the one that says, you know, this is the new story. The other thing, and I said this last night at the session meeting, and going back to the blues. So in the blues, you've got these people that lived in the Mississippi Delta, really small towns. They had their guitar and they would play fish fries and juke houses and things like that, when moonshiners would often pay blues artists to come and play while they sold moonshine. And of course, they would subsidize the artist with their product at times. And these guys all developed different styles. And it all came from a culture of, there's never been any industry in the Mississippi Delta. There is farming, and that's it. And it's a hardscrabble existence. In urban Mississippi, there were 2 whites for every black, but in the Delta, there's 5 blacks for every white person. And it's people who were part of the Depression. Well, so the blues develop, they go to Chicago, all this, and then they kind of die off with rock and roll and rhythm and blues. And then these white,
But they also use some of that.
they use some of that. Oh yeah, oh.
Meld all together.
As Buddy Waters said, the blues had a baby and they called it rock and roll. But what happened was these musicologists were going back and doing the study of the culture, and they were discovering these old guys. So like some of them, you know, Robert Johnson was poisoned by a jealous husband who probably had every right to be jealous. Charlie Patton died in obscurity, and these were the greats of that time. But some of them survived, and so people like Mississippi John Hurt and Son House were now back in style again, but not for black people, for white people. They played the Newport Folk Festival, and white kids were learning, you know, the guitar licks and all that, and it's like, and they're looking and saying, can white people sing the blues? Because we haven't had it. You know, I mean, I've had periods where I've been up and periods I've been down. I've had some trials, some adversity in life, but I don't know what it's like to be a hardscrabble farmer in Mississippi in 1930. I have no idea. And yet, here's this music I'm attracted to. One of the issues with Revelation, it's not meant for people who live in the dominant culture. It's meant for people in the minority who are oppressed. And which is why many of the spirituals draw on Revelation as well. 2 of the best books, and I don't have one of them with me. Alan Bosak wrote a book. I'll hold this up for the people there. It's called Comfort and Protest. He's a South African Reformed minister, and he wrote this while apartheid was still very active in South Africa. And he found that Revelation was the book that really spoke to their circumstance. There's another book called Let Every Nation and Every Tribe, and they have people from Africa, people from Latin America, American urban blacks, looking at Revelation from their perspective, and they find it. This is a book that feeds them. For us, it's kind of, we're like those white kids watching Mississippi John Hurt. I hear you singing about oppression, but we don't know that. We've never been a part of that. We are middle to upper middle class white people who form the dominant culture. And for those who are not a part of that, Revelation has a specific meaning. And so the question is, what does it mean for us as we watch this, as we watch the story unfold? And we're not an actor in the story. Too often, a lot of times, to understand the scriptures, one of the things I do in my meditations is I put myself into the story. Who would I be in this story? How would I react to this circumstance? And that's how I come up with some of the stories I tell in sermons. You know, why did the guy, the paralytic, need to be forgiven first and then healed? What was it in his life that was what Jesus fixed on and said, your sins are forgiven? What was that like? With Revelation, it's a lot harder to do that. We don't know oppression. I have never, ever been persecuted for my faith, ever. And I don't expect I ever will. You know, things may change, I don't know, but I'm not counting on that. And so as I read the story, I can take hope that this is happening, but there's a lot that I may not understand. You know, I mean, even with the natural disasters, man, we got FEMA. We had fires here, and those were bad. But most of us did okay during that time. You know, there are people that were totally wiped out. How many of our congregation lived in trailer parks? Not many. You know, I think we've had a few people that lost their house, a few people whose parents lost their house, but we're not like some families where they just lost everything. You know, so when Katrina hit New Orleans, we're sitting watching it on our TVs. And the rich people were able to get out really quickly, and it was those that didn't have cars, that didn't have anywhere to go, didn't have relatives outside. They were the ones. So that's part of the reason we struggle with it. You know, it's like almost it wasn't written for us. It was, but the question of what we learned from it, I'm still trying to wrap my head around and how we get it. So there's one book that I use, and that's actually where I got the title for the course. It's called Reading Revelation Responsibly, by a guy named Michael Dorman. And he makes the argument that we are in Rome, but we're so cozy to Rome, we don't notice it. I heard Billy Graham's granddaughter was interviewed the other day, and they were doing a story on churches and QAnon and white nationalism. And she said, Christianity knows no nationalism. It doesn't know American nationalism. It doesn't know white nationalism. It doesn't know any. Christianity does not recognize nations. It recognizes the people of God. You know, and Pentecost, everybody heard it in their own language. The one barrier that really separates us is language. And you know, when Hitler was invading countries, he started with the German-speaking countries first. Austria, but then that wasn't an invasion. That was the word they use is Einschluss, and Einschluss is the word when you're hooking a train car up to the main car. So Austria, the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia was a German-speaking land. Poland, which was also a lot of German speakers. Only then did they go to the country because they wanted the people, the language there. And if Pentecost linguistics is broken down, it's destroyed. And he makes the argument that we have cozied up too much to the dominant culture and we don't realize it. My most uncomfortable Sundays in church are 4th of July because I'm expected to do something patriotic. Memorial Day is a little bit easier because we can commemorate those who died. That's not a problem. But Mother's Day, Father's Day, the other morning in my devotion, I was reading where Jesus said, unless you hate your father and your mother and your husband and your wife and your children and your sisters and your brothers, you cannot be a part of the kingdom of God. What does Mother's Day mean when you hear something like that? One of my professors did a sermon on that, hating your mother is the way to peace. And in World War I and the Civil War, when we sent people over, they were in state militias. So all of the people from North Carolina were in one unit. And the desertion rate in the Civil War was enormous. You got all these guys from different places. The one ancestor I know that fought in the Civil War was a deserter. You get all these North Carolinians together, and they're down in Mississippi fighting, and they're going, "Why are we here? I miss barbecue. They don't have that cook down here. Let's go home." And they took off. World War I is the same place. They had a lot of people that they didn't feel invested in the war. The military did a study, and they found out that around 50-some% of the rifles in both the Civil War and World War II were never fired in combat. Never fired. Because why am I shooting that person? I don't know who they are. And your tribe was who you really cared about. And so what the Army did for World War II was they put now all of a sudden a platoon would be composed of a Southern guy from North Carolina, a Texan, a guy from San Diego who was a surfer before he joined the Army, a Jewish guy from New York, a blue collar worker in the Midwest. You put them all together and you say, this is your bond, this is your buddies. And by breaking down those ties, they got people to become efficient fighting machines. And so when we think of ourselves as tribalistic in terms of families, in terms of economic status, in terms of race, we form these tribes and we become more committed to the tribe than we are to the overarching issues we face before us. Does that make sense? Yeah. Going into the chapel, he overheard, he preached it at Southeastern Baptist Seminary in North Carolina. And as he was going in, he heard two guys ahead of him say, hating your mother is the way to peace. Why do we let these non-biblical people come in and preach to us? And it's like, you didn't hear that part, did you? We miss the suffering part of Jesus. I don't know if you remember the PTL Club. Yeah, Jim Baker, we call it Pass the Loop Club in Charlotte. And I used to watch it until someone said something that just made me despair of being a human being. I usually get 10 minutes into it before that happened. But once I was watching it, and there was a couple on there, and they were the health and wealth gospel type people. If you just have enough faith, you'll have all the money you need, you'll be healthy. And if you don't have that, it's because you don't have enough faith. You got enough faith. And the way you show your faith is you give me your money. Because I'm like God, so give me the money and you'll be a very wealthy. Well, this couple was on there and they were doing that. And they had a guest host. And the host looked at the couple and said, how do you deal with the suffering of Jesus? Our Messiah suffered. And the woman rose back and said, my Jesus never suffered. The culture took over the gospel. So Gorman makes that article in here, and it's a pretty radical book in some ways. There are parts of it I thought, I don't know if I want to get bogged down in that stuff, but that's important. And then for the seven churches, this is a book by a guy named John Stott. He's an English evangelical, back when that didn't mean right wing. And he goes over the letters of the seven churches. And so this book is just about that part. I used a commentary by a guy who has the most unfortunate name for an academic ever, Eugene Bory. But he wrote a commentary on Revelation for this interpretation. And this is pretty readable for a commentary. Most commentaries, I get lost in them. And then one other, I didn't get into this as much as I wanted to, because I was just trying to get the basics down. But this is a woman named Marva Dawn, and she suffers from several congenital illnesses. And she talks about how Revelation helped her come to terms with her own suffering. And so, we need to remember that when I say that we're upper middle class white people in the dominant culture, that doesn't mean we never suffer. And she's taking it to where her point is for physical suffering. And so anyway, so that's all I've really prepared for tonight. And I'm willing to do questions at this point. We'll start with yours in the New Jerusalem. Okay. Can you guys hear Doris? You online? Okay, I'll repeat the question. Can you hear me though? Okay, I'll repeat the question after she asks.
The letters to the seven cities, is there a unifying factor, and how do they differ?
The letters to the seven. She's asking about the letters to the seven churches, and is there a unifying factor, and how do they differ? The interesting thing about them is the differences. And if you go back to the idea that 7 is the number of completion. So he's really writing to all the churches. And each church has a slightly different issue it faces. And each church faces it a little differently. So part of what makes them, I think, helpful for us is the differences. What church at some point hasn't lost its first love? I mean, that's what we struggle with. What church hasn't wrestled with what it means to be acculturated? I'm trying to remember the church now, but most of the churches were praised for standing up for their faith, with a couple of exceptions. What Christian doesn't know what it's like to be lukewarm? I just don't feel like it today. As a minister, it's kind of like, one of the perennial questions that Angelique and I go over is, how far can I go this week before they kick me out? And there have been times where I would reach on this. She said, "You can't say that in church," and struggling with, well, and I usually listen to her, but does that make me lukewarm? And that struggle needs to be there consistently. And then Laodicea, how many churches, especially churches like us, have a lot of things, but are really poor in spirit? So, I mean, they're once it's universal. These are issues that face all churches. But it was Tolstoy said that every happy family was alike, and every unhappy family was different in how it is unhappy. And so he praises the churches for consistent things, but the problems are inconsistent. And that's so we all kind of have that. And so it's a warning, not just to those churches, but to our church, which is why I'm doing a sermon series on them coming up. But then what are they praised for? We should try to attain that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? You guys on the screen, do you have any questions? No questions? Oh my gosh. Well, we're done. Okay.
That's kind of catching up on some of the reading of the end of the chapters, and there was, the Babylon they had all those wonderful of all, with the slavery issue.
Yeah.
And I kind of didn't get that. I mean, who would be a slave and.
Slavery was throughout the Roman Empire.
Well, but, so.
Repeating itself.
Who owned this slave?
So the way you became a slave back then, slavery in the American South was based on race. Slavery under the Romans was based on if you were a defeated nation, they would cart many of the prominent citizens off and sell them as slaves. St. Patrick was a slave in Ireland before he escaped and came back. So any well-to-do household would own slaves. Any household that's above, and the words middle class and upper class don't mean a whole lot given their economy and our economy, but any household of means would have slaves.
They're people that come from countries.
Either that or they'd gone broke and they had to sell family members or they had to sell themselves.
Not a good thing. Not a good thing.
Not a good thing. No, not a good thing. No, but slavery was pretty common back then. And you know, when I was in Latin America, one of the things that's different that you see now is that people don't have appliances; they have maids. So you don't have a dishwasher, but you got a woman comes in and washes your dishes. You don't have a vacuum cleaner.
I have that now.
I am that in our house. yeah, but for the Romans, it was the same thing.
I had this funny thing happen to me, what you just said. When we moved to New Orleans, somebody had found us a house to live in, and it belonged to a lady who had just gone to a nursing home or something. She had lived there with her maid for many, many years. And Lynn had arrived at the house first, and he called back to Oregon and he said, "You better bring anything from your kitchen that you really want to use." And it was all backwards. And the maid just used what was there. She never thought to ask for anything more.
Yeah.
Or maybe she didn't never buy it, but it was really tiny and really backward, and it really was not convenient.
Most places have a class. The original question about slavery in the Roman world, and in Revelation 18, when they're talking about all the people that lost when the great beast fell, merchants, long list of merchants, kings, and then at the end, people who sold people, people who sold slaves. So the question is about slavery in there. Yeah, almost every culture has a group of people who have to sell themselves for labor and don't get a choice on how they do it. Yeah, a guy named Wendell Berry wrote an essay years ago on why I will never have a computer. He's a very wonderful writer, very prolific, poems, novels, and essays. And he got more flack from that. And he said, instead of having a computer, I write my manuscripts out longhand. My wife takes them and she types them up, and then we send them to the publisher. And a lot of people are offended that his wife did that. And it's convenient you have a wife who does what you could be doing on a computer. And his response to that was, it's interesting. You would rather my wife sell her talents to someone who doesn't care about her and she doesn't care about than to work for someone she loves. I remember I was challenged once to come up with a topic on Exodus 21, where it's the rules for selling your daughter into slavery. And right after we get the 10 Commandments, we get how to sell your daughter into slavery and all this. And I commented on the fact that we think this is old, but when my daughter was in college, she wanted to go into communications. And what's worse, she wanted to go into broadcasting. And what's worse is she wanted to go into public radio. And my thought was, okay, you'll never want for mugs or tote bags, but they don't make much money. And I was on the verge of pushing her to do PR instead. And I thought, wait a second, I'm asking her to sell herself to a firm for something she doesn't want to do. Am I different from those fathers? Yes, there is a quantitative difference, but the principle's the same, and we don't hear this term because unfortunately the person who came up with was Karl Marx, and anything Marx said was bad, but he used the term wage slavery. If you are in an underclass and your schooling hasn't been that great, and you're a steady worker, you have to sell your labor to someone. And yeah, you get compensated for it, but you can't live on minimum wage these days. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, Josie.
So, this is in chapter 7.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and it's the great multitude with white robes.
Uh-huh.
And so what I saw interesting is after that I looked, and there before me were a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language. So that means from everyone, not Muslims.
Muslims didn't exist back then.
Because they wouldn't be following, but still, some of them might.
Okay,
Yeah.
you're asking a really interesting question. She's asking about, in Revelation, it talks about the people in white robes, and there's people from every race and nation in the world, which leads to the question, what if they never heard about Jesus? And you asked about Muslims in specific. They didn't exist until the 600s, but you had all sorts of pagan religions going on, and you're growing up in that, and how does that work? One of the interesting debates, which I didn't get into, was, does Revelation preach a limited salvation? In other words, only a few will be saved, or does it preach universal salvation, that all will one day come and bow down to Jesus Christ? And the answer is yes. That you have aspects of both. Again, this isn't systematic. The essence of what Revelation is trying to tell us is God is in charge. And we get the feeling sometimes that we want to judge people by standards, and this is who God ought to save, and this is who God ought not to save. And I just think God works with a whole different standard. There was, in North Carolina, one of my mentors was riding around. He was in rural North Carolina. He was riding around with these guys, white guys, and they saw a black guy. His name was Pat, and they called him Pat because he was kind of gimpy-legged, and he'd go door to door, and he would fix things for people. He'd show up if he had something broken, Pat could fix it. And in his pack, he had all the tools he used to do that. Well, he was also a preacher. And they saw Pack, and they slammed the brakes on, told Pack, get in the car. This is in the 50s, North Carolina, rural North Carolina. And Pack gets in the car, and my friend's going, this could go bad in a lot of ways. And they turned back to him, and they said, Pack, why did you do that funeral for that guy last week? He was just a shiftless inward, and he didn't deserve no funeral. And Pack says, I just take him to the river and cut him loose. I am not responsible for who come and go. And there's something about that, we don't know the issues behind where people are. We don't know what's keeping people from making a kind of commitment to God that is similar to ours. And C.S. Lewis has this thing where he says, someone may look terrible from a distance, but if you get to know them, you see how far they've come from where they started. I middle class Presbyterian family, that's where I started from. So, off the bat, I look like an A+ student. But someone who started off with an abusive family situation, substance abuse problems all around them, no education, and they come up a little bit, God sees that. God judges in ways we don't, and we can't, and we shouldn't. And so at the end of, and C.S. Lewis is a person I go to a lot for this. At the end of his Chronicles of Narnia, it's the last battle. And in the book, there is Aslan is the Christ figure, and he's a lion in the book. And he's throughout all 7 books. But there's this monkey who talks this chimp, a monkey that talks this donkey into putting on an old lion suit. And the people who weren't from Narnia worshiped a god called Tash. And Narnians worship Aslan. And they said, this is Tashlet. And would parade around, and they get people involved in that. And one fellow in particular, who's a follower of Tash, challenged the monkey and the donkey. The donkey was just, I don't know what I'm doing. The monkey was the real trickster there who was trying to make trouble. And he challenged him, and he says, you are not Tash. I follow Tash. I follow only Tash. And that is, you are not him. Well, later at the end of the last battle, which is similar to the last battle in Revelation, this guy shows up in heaven. And the kids who are part of the story ask Aslan, why does he get to go? He never followed you. And Aslan says, when he followed me to the best of when he followed Tash to the best of what he knew, he was following me. And you know, he didn't have the opportunity to learn about me, but he was committed to his God, and I was that God, and he got it wrong about who that God was and everything. But do you blame him? But he was devout. In his heart, he was doing the right thing. So it is possible we will see suicide bombers in heaven. I realize that's a controversial thing to say. You know, not all of them. I'm not saying they automatically get to go, but we'll see people in heaven that really surprise us. So as to whether or not the multitude is everybody going to be there, I don't know. God does, and let God sort all that out.
Give us on our deathbed, right?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, if we're knowing we're dying, I would think that we're gonna really do some praying. Most people will.
Yeah, and some people do, and
Yeah.
you know, for others, they've been so damaged by the church. When I was my first church, I did the God and Country thing, and at the end of it's for Cub Scouts, and at the end of it, asked the Cub Scouts if they could come to church and we would present their medals in church, because it's not done through the Scouts; it's only done through local churches, and so they don't sponsor. They don't. They recognize the medal, but you know, there's different denominations. And so one family,
Pause that one.
I'll be there. I'm not sure about that. And he did show up, and I looked like he wanted to bolt. And you know, he was like on the edge of his chair, kind of like this the whole time, and just holding on to the chair. But he wanted to see his son get the medal. And later, the wife told me he was so abused by a church when he was a kid that he had to take Valium to go that morning.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it's so sad.
But he went. Yeah, it is. It is. The kids who are abused by priests, they can die hating the church, and I think somehow they may end up in heaven. You know, we can't really judge what's in a person's heart. God does, but
Well, we don't have the right to judge.
no, we don't. No, we don't. You know, and it's more than just walking a mile in someone's moccasins. We don't know what's going on in people's lives. And
So
so
that's something I think that a lot of us learned when we had the privilege of having the luncheons and things like that, giving out food and working in the grocery. We met so many different people and accepted so many people that maybe in other situations we wouldn't. But I know that I got lots more out of it than I ever was giving, just by seeing people and realizing the humanity of their being there.
Lynn was referring back when we did the food bank here, we would have a lot of people come in and we would let them shop, and it was a lot of times the same people week after week, and we would get to know them, and you know, you realize what they're going through, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that it was helping us grow in our faith, just by dealing with people who hadn't had all the things that we had. One of my friends, and now a parishioner here, first time he injected drugs in his arm, he was 13, and he got them from his mom. Now he's clean and sober now, and has been for a while. So, but yeah, I don't blame him for anything he did.
No, I don't know, because they're growing and changing all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's just hard. I worked with one sociopath when I worked with the kids up in Alaska for the Presbyterian Hospitality House, and he scared me. He scared me. He would sit in the meetings that we would have. I did group therapy, and he'd take his finger and he'd go click, click, click. And I was looking at him, I thought, I'm looking at a school shooter. And later, we found out he had somehow managed to get a hold of a gun. And he was dumb enough to show it to another kid who was smart enough to tell the people right away what would happen. And he ended up into the juvenile system. But, you know, that's, I don't know what to do about people like that, how you handle that. God sorts that out. Other questions? You've been silent.
Can we start over?
Well, actually, I'd kind of like to, because now I feel like I got it down. Now I'm ready to teach it.
This is the second time I've taken a class on this, and it's still overwhelming.
It is overwhelming, and what I would say is if you play with it for a while. This has also been, let me say, one of the most enjoyable Bible studies I've ever done, and it's done more to change me than any other Bible study I think I've read. But to keep reading in it and just let it flow. One of my favorite barbecue stories. Kid wanted to learn how to do barbecue, and he brought a notebook, and the pitmaster said, "Go sit on that stump and just watch." So the kid sat on the stump and he made all these notes. So, chicken went in at this time, came out at this time, looked like this. Pork went in at this time, was in there for so long, except for the ones that were here. And he thought he was, going to town with this. And at the end of the day, the pitmaster came to him and said, "What'd you learn?" He pulled out his notebook and he started reading off stuff. And the guy took the notebook and threw it in the fire. And he said, No, I did not ask you to sit and take notes. I want you to listen to the meat. That's what you got to learn how to do. Listen to the meat. It will tell you when it's ready. And how do you impart that to someone? And in a sense, revelation is like that. You just got to listen to it and let it kind of get in you and roll around a little bit. Let it disturb you.
My son Henry was a plumber, and one time I said to him when he was in master plumbing school, I'm like, "What is taking so long?" It took him like 8 years to get through the program. Because you have to work, and you have to work for a master plumber, and you have to go to school. And he said, "Well, Mom, it's more than hot on the left and cold on the right." And I said, "Yeah, I get that," but he said, "You have to tell water what to do."
Yeah.
And I said, "What?" And he goes, "Water will do what it wants to. You have to tell it what to do." And I said, "So you're a Zen plumber."
So what Megan was talking about was one of her sons was in a plumbing program. I don't know if you heard that or not. And Megan was asking, "Why is it taking you so long to get through the program?" He says, "Mom, you got to learn to tell the water what to do. It wants to do what it wants to do, and you got to learn to tell it what to do. It's more than just hot on the one side and cold on the other. But you got to, and so I said, like a Zen plumber. And,
he was a very type A personality, so he wasn't
Right, yeah. I take most Zen Buddhists are type A personalities. The ones I know, oh yeah, oh the ones I know, yeah. I've been to a few meditation things, and like when they serve you, your chopsticks have to go a certain way. If they're skewed slightly, they'll make you move them. I mean, it's not that laid back, hey, do what you want stuff that most people think it is.
There is a hippie plumber from Ashland. He's great. He's really right. Well, we gotta fix this. He smells like patchouli and he hugs everybody.
When we moved to Alaska, we had this trucking company actually heard we were moving. They called us and they wanted to do an international move. It was called Truck and Movers, which, if you know anything, trucking is a song by the Grateful Dead. And but Alaska's considered an international move. They wanted an international move under their belt. And this one guy with a ponytail, first he gets them out in the yard and they practice Tai Chi for half an hour. And then he walks around and he points to stuff, and he's got 3 guys following him. And they would pick up the stuff and take it outside and put it in front of one of these boxes, one of these crates they had. And he would put it all in the crate. And when I got the stuff, it was cardboard boxes with wooden frames. And when I got the stuff in Alaska, when it finally got to the warehouse, they called me and they said, we cannot guarantee anything. I have never seen a move in cardboard frames like this. So we'll bring it to you like we were supposed to, but we are not responsible for what happened. He wanted to make sure I knew that. There's nothing broken. There's nothing. I mean, and pulling out was like Tetris, pulling stuff out. But he just learned to go with the flow. And Revelation is a disturbing flow. Huh?
It's like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Yeah. I mean, Revelation is it's like a river, and there are rapids, and rapids can turn your boat over sometimes. So it's not like you just groove to and get into it, but you got to go with the flow of where it's going. I like that because it's taking you somewhere, and unlike the plumber who has to, and that's the way we like to do theology sometimes, make it go where we want it to go. With Revelation, you have to go where it's taking you, like being on a river.
He came here to visit one time and he looked at those beautiful fountains up at Centennial Golf Course that were just getting built. And I said, what do you think of those? And he goes, it's a lot of maintenance to keep one of those things going. And I said, so? And he said, I guarantee you they will never work at the same time. Each side. And they never have until recently. So that's been 15 years.
You saw about a fountain.
Yeah.
Her son saw a fountain, and his mom asked what he thought of. He said, they'll never work at the same time. And for 15 years they didn't, because all the maintenance they would take.
It became a joke. Ed and I would go by and go like, no,
nope, not working.
The left one's working, but not the right one.
So other questions?
Left one's empty.
Any guys on the screen have any questions yet?
We start over.
Well, we're doing adult ed. We moved the Sunday school, and it's possible we could do a class during adult ed. We would do it much longer. So not just a 7-week thing. Yeah, I mean, we were gulping it down.
Yeah, but you wouldn't be able to teach it because of between services?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's a long time for you to be.
Well, I've done all the research, and so now it's just going back, and it's a lot easier to teach in small sections because the large gulps, I got to look there and it's like, yeah, this is really cool, but I don't have time for that this week. And in a classroom situation where you would have 12 weeks to do it, that would be a very different.
I think that's what I had is much more.
Yeah, it's a big bump.
A long time ago.
So we, basically, you were trying to drink out of a fire hose while we're doing that. Yeah, I would enjoy actually doing a Sunday school class on it, and when we get maybe in the fall, we could do something like that. Other questions? Yeah, Lonnie.
Lonnie, yeah. So, do I understand this correctly that number 7 is that things are complete,
Yes,
but the number 666 is incomplete?
yes, it's 3 times incomplete.
3 times incomplete.
Yeah,
And
it
then
is.
and then that's the mark of the beast? Or is this
Yes, yeah, and so there's 2 ways to read that. You can read it in Greek and Hebrew. They don't use numbers. Letters represent numbers, and so if you take the equivalency of the name Nero and add an N to the end of the word Nero, so it's Neron, that totals up to 666. So it could possibly be Nero. The problem with that, though, is that Nero was dead when John was writing. So it's, it still could be that, and Nero just being a stand-in for all the bad Roman Caesars. Or it could mean something that's kind of like the Tower of Babel, where anyone who sets themselves up as a god is going to be incomplete. And by setting themselves up that way, they are going to do violence, religious violence, to who God really is. So anyone we set up over and above the God we worship is incomplete as a God. So the way Germans worship Hitler, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer got in trouble for saying Germans need to worship Jesus, not Hitler. And that was a very problematic statement. He had set himself up that way. Often dictators do that. Their word is the last word. Or when we set up human standards above God's standards. So for instance, one of the churches I attended back in North Carolina was, right beside Duke University. And in the mid 60s, a group of students from North Carolina A&T, which was a historically Black university, decided they wanted to come to church. And a bunch of them came in and they sat down together. And for them, it was, we can worship wherever we want. For the church, it was like, what are all these Black people doing in our church? And so they had an argument about it, and the pastor stood firm. He said, anyone is allowed to worship here, anyone. And for people who had problems, people said they were going to leave the church. And he went and visited every person that said they had a problem. And one woman in particular, he pulled out his Bible and he talked about there's no Jew or Greek, there's no race in Jesus, there's all this. And the woman finally said, Pastor, I don't care what that book says. I am not going to church for them. That's a 666 moment where that the white Southern culture took precedence over the Word of God, and she was just honest about it. Unlike other people, at least she was honest about it. But we have a system where we, in the Presbyterian Church, we recognize that temptation. And so it's hard to find, they exist, but it's hard to find a Presbyterian who gets way too big for his or her britches, because they've got a session to knock them down. And that's right. I mean, that's, there's certain things I can do here, but there's a lot I can't do. And last night we had a discussion about how long we have to wear masks and stuff like that. And I spent the whole time listening to what people were saying and trying to do that, because I'm not in charge. So we have a system to alleviate that. Other churches don't quite have that. So 666, it possibly could refer to Nero in a symbolic way, but it also could refer to any human being that sets themselves up and over as a leader of Jesus Christ.
So how did it come out to be that it's the beast?
Well, because we recently seen a dragon and two beasts come up, and the
Okay.
sign for the beast on the land was 666.
Okay, that I lost that somewhere. Okay.
Yeah, you get the dragon coming up, and then you get the first beast coming up out of the water, and the beast gets its authority from that dragon, which is Satan. And then the second beast comes up from the land, and that beast is helped by the first beast to become like a god.
Mm.
And its number is 666. And then, of course, the beasts are all overthrown. Dragons cast in a fiery lake, beasts are cast in a fiery lake. God's still in control. It looks like these guys are in control. But according to John in Revelation, no, they're not. No, they're not. Jesus is in control. God's in control. So, good
And so
question.
nobody's perfect, and so that's why nobody's a 7.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So yeah, some of us are just 3s and 4s.
Well, you're a 6. No, not a 6, 6, 6.
No, no, no,
6.
Other questions?
Thank you for doing this class.
Oh, it's been fun. Like I said, I got so much more out of it than you guys did. And even trying to limit myself, it was like, trying to get you a drink out of a fire hose. But yeah, no, it was fun for me. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I'd do it again, like Josie, and you
Okay.
know,
Well,
yeah.
we'll talk about education committee. And I can't tell you right now we'll do it because it's part of a committee, and I'm not, king and be all here. So it'll go through committee, but that this could happen. So
Okay.
okay then. There's a phrase in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, I think it's verse 3 or 4, where it says, the person who thinks they know everything doesn't know anything yet. And I've taken a lot of comfort in that verse over the years. But the person who loves God is known by God. That's how it finishes. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And I love that because it's you try to get to know things about things, and you think you've mastered it, but very few people really master something. And probably even the greatest musicians, the greatest athletes are still working on their craft. And that's what makes, I was talking to a guy today, said he started playing guitar at 16 and he played till he was 21 and he never got better after that. He thought he'd learned enough and that was it. And
Some of us get worse.
but in your head, you're getting better. Yeah, with music, your physical skills might drop off, but yeah. Well, let's close with prayer. Lord God, thank you for this class and for the people who've been here. We pray for the people that weren't able to make it here tonight and ask that you be with them, especially Loretta taking care of her dog. And just pray that we could continue this journey, both with Revelation and really with you. And the big flow of water is the river that you are. And may we go through that river when we encounter rapids, knowing that you're in control, and may we enjoy the placid parts of that river. But may it take us one day to that New Jerusalem where we will see you face to face. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, thank you, everybody.